Okay, so good afternoon. Again, as always, good evening, depending on where you are. So good to be together again. Welcome back to the third session of Halakhah for the Ages, reading Responsa from Bygone era with Dr. Rachel Furst. Just a couple reminders. When you're not actively speaking, please keep yourself muted and feel free to unmute whenever you would like to participate verbally. You could also write questions and comments in the chat here on Zoom or as a Facebook comment. If you're watching us live, welcome to you as well. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rachel.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you again for that brief introduction. And we are going to be continuing on from more or less from where we left off last week. For those who participated last week and for those who didn't, I'll just provide a brief sort of recap so that you'll know what we're up to. And then we'll get started with our new material. We are talking about, this course is about the Responsa literature. In our first session 2 weeks ago, we spoke about the Responsa literature as a genre of Halachic writing, and we particularly focused on the beginnings of that type of Halachic literature. Last week, we began to focus on the era of Responsa literature and the type of material that we're going to really be dealing with for the remainder of the course, and that is the Responsa literature of the medieval period. And when I say medieval, I mean the period that's often in Halakhic terminology referred to as the period of the Rishonim. This is a period that spanned roughly, let's say, 5 or so centuries, from around 1000 of the Common Era until, let's say, the writing of the Shulchan Aruch in the 16th century. And within that span of about 500 years, last week, we began to talk about some of the features and characteristics of the Responsa literature during this classic era of its genesis, of its writing. And I mentioned that we in this course are going to be focusing in particular, we're going to be from here through the end of the course, devoting each week to examining usually highlighting one responsum that we'll be delving into as an example of some of the various features that are particularly interesting about this Responsa literature from a variety of different standpoints. And these examples are going to be drawn mostly from the geographic region known as Ashkenaz, which includes the German-speaking lands as well as northern France, but particularly the lands that were part of the medieval German Empire, that is the German-speaking lands of medieval Europe. And we're going to be focusing mostly on the period, the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. Last week, we had the opportunity to meet one of the important respondents of the era, Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. And we also began to talk last week, the example that we looked at, and therefore the subject of our discussion was about the way that the Responsa literature was Responsa were sometimes generated as the result of court cases that came to Jewish, and usually when we say Jewish, in this context, we usually mean rabbinic courts, or at least courts on which at least one rabbinic figure was a judge, was sitting. And when the court was unsure about how to deal with a particular case, they would write away to a well-known rabbinic authority and ask for assistance in determining the appropriate outcome of the litigation between the parties. And this Halachic authority's response would constitute the responsum and would be intended to help guide the judges as to how they should, again, proceed to rule. We spoke a little bit in that context about the nature of the Jewish court system in medieval Europe and in medieval Ashkenaz in particular. One of the things that I mentioned last week and that we had the opportunity to see is the way that these responsa actually constitute one of the best repositories that we have for court material. That is for sometimes witness depositions, sometimes the claims of the various litigants, and generally speaking, the kind of summary of the judges of the court case that was transpiring. This is one of the best, again, sources, one of the best ways that we know about the way that Jewish courts operated in this pre-modern era. And just again to remind you, for those who participated, the specific case that we took a look at last week involved a married man who was away on business for over a year and returned home to find that his wife had apparently become pregnant and given birth to a child that she may have in fact subsequently killed in his absence, and demanded that the judges of his community respond to this case. And we saw the details of that, and again, the way in which the Responsa literature addresses that and preserves that case in our example from last week. This week, we're going to be moving on to look at a new responsum, and in that regard, also a new case. It is also going to be a case that features a married couple who got into a dispute. Although in the instance we're going to be looking at today, the primary halachic issue that they were fighting about was actually a matter of defamation. So it will be an opportunity for us to see the way that defamation featured in the Responsa literature. But again, it's another opportunity for us to examine some of the features of this literature that that I think are unique and worth highlighting. And ultimately, our goal is also to ask ourselves, these responsa are certainly very fascinating records of the historical past and of the way that Jewish law functioned as law in practice, and also, in eras of the past, and also the way in which it was preserved for the ages. So we're going to be needing to ask ourselves these kinds of questions as we go along. But without much further ado, I do want us to begin taking a look at our example from today. I apologize in advance. I have two different screens to share, so there might be a little bit of toggling back and forth. All of you, I believe, all of you who are registered for the course should have received a PDF file that contains the main text of this responsum that we're going to be focusing on today. And for those who did not receive it or who don't have it easily accessible, Evie has put it into the chat so you can easily download that. That's going to be the main text that we're working with. And again, to repeat what I said last week, I'm going to be providing that our main responsum text each week as a PDF, because I know that some people like to take notes on the text. Certainly one way to follow along. So you can either print it out or have it on your screen if that's easier. I'm also going to be putting it up on the screen that I'm sharing with you. At the same time, I'm also going to, as I said, I'm going to have to be toggling back and forth a little bit, and I hope that there won't be any technical issues there. I do have a PowerPoint, which I'll be happy to share with you after the class, that includes some supporting texts, maps, you'll see. Okay. So let's begin though. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's begin by taking a look at the responsum itself. So this is again the text that you should have in front of you or accessible to you as well. Okay, one thing that I want to point out here is that this particular responsum is taken from an important collection of medieval Ashkenazi responsa. Last week we spoke about a responsum that appeared in the Tshuvot Maimoniot, as well as in parallel in some of the collections of responsa that are attributed to Rabbi Meir of Rodenburg. This responsum that we're going to be looking at today, as you can see from the title here, or from the heading, this is a responsum that appears in a collection that is kind of named as the Responsa of Rabbi Chaim ben Isaac or Zarua. And as a matter of fact, if you scroll down to the very end of this responsa, you will see that in fact, Chaim, son of Isaac, may he rest in Eden, or Chaim ben Harav Yitzchak, Nishmato B'Torah Chaim, is in fact the one who signed this particular piece, meaning he was in fact the author of this responsum that we're going to be looking at together. Now, the reason I point this out is because it's not, may sound obvious, but it is in fact not always the case that the responsa that appear in a collection attributed to a particular rabbinic scholar, like Chaim ben Isaac or Zarua, or like Meir of Rothenburg, were actually authored by that individual. I'm going to repeat that, right? It is not the case that all of the responsa that appear in the collection of responsa that is called Shut Maharach or Zarua, or the responsa of Chaim ben Isaac or Zarua, were actually authored by that individual. Many of them were. That is, many of the responsa in this collection were signed by Chaim or Zarua, and therefore we know that they were his. Some responsa that were not signed, we nonetheless know from various literary clues or from the way that they're embedded in the text, or from comparing the opinion that's expressed with other opinions in signed pieces, that they were authored by Chaim ben Isaac or Zarua. However, it was typical during this period in time for individual scholars to also collect the responsa of their predecessors or of their colleagues, and in many cases to include those in their own collections. I'll have a little bit more to say this week, next week, and in coming weeks about the nature of these medieval responsa collections, about how they were generated, how they came to be put together. So I'll have more to say about that. But for the meantime, what I want to, again, make note of is that these collections that were put together include pieces by usually a variety of different medieval authors, even, again, when they're named or when they're attributed to a particular individual. Okay, but that being said, this particular piece was in fact authored by Chaim ben Isaac or Zarua. Now, just to make clear a little bit the timeline that we're talking about, when we switch to the PowerPoint, I'll show you on that timeline that I introduced last week. But I'll say for now that Chaim ben Isaac was the son of the very famous Isaac ben Moshe, Isaac ben Moses or Zarua, the one who authored the Halakhic work that was called the Or Zarua, who is known as the Or Zarua, was this Rabbi Chaim's father. Chaim ben Isaac was probably born in the middle of the 13th century. That is, he was probably born around maybe 1240 or so. We don't know exactly. As a matter of fact, we don't know all that many details about his personal life history. But we do know that he became one of the foremost students of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who we met last week. Rabbi Meir was, in the latter half of the 13th century, probably the most important rabbinic figure in the German lands. And Chaim ben Isaac was, again, one of his foremost students. Meir of Rothenburg, as I mentioned last week, was in 1286 imprisoned, and he ultimately died in prison in 1293. And during that period of time when he was out of commission, and then after his death, a number of his students kind of stepped up to the plate and became the rabbinic leaders of German Jewry, and Chaim ben Isaac was one of those. We don't actually know exactly when he died, probably sometime in the early decades of the 14th century, so maybe around 1310, 1315, but we don't know exactly. We know that he lived in various periods of time in a whole slew of different cities in the medieval German Empire. And I say all of these things because, again, one of the things that we always are interested in doing, certainly as historians, is trying to locate and date the material that we're working with. And sometimes with responsa literature, it's not always possible. Last week, I mentioned to you that we had an unusual piece because it actually included a date, which is very sort of, I don't want to say unique, but very unusual for medieval responsa. And it also included places. If you recall, the rabbis located themselves. This one that we're going to be looking at today doesn't have quite as many identifying details, but it does have still, I would say, more than the average. And to make it clear what I'm talking about, if you take a look at the beginning of this passage, you'll see Asher sha'alta al Levi, what you asked concerning Levi. Levi may be a stock name, but it might actually be the name of the litigant that we're going to meet who features in this particular piece. Either way, it's obviously not a very identifying name. It's not like we could really trace this person otherwise. But what you will see if you kind of even, we're going to read this more in depth, but if you just scan down with your eyes, you may see the place name Mainz. And we're going to see that Mainz features, as well as the Rhine River, which runs alongside Mainz. They feature in the story or in the case. And that already is more, that allows us to sort of locate where this case was taking place, which is, again, more than we have to work with as far as many medieval responsa are concerned. We're going to see there's a lot more historical detail in this story that is, I think, quite interesting and that really allows us to kind of, again, use this as a historical record in a way that many responsa are just too vague to work with. Another thing sort of on the form level that I want to point out about this particular piece we're going to be looking at today, last week we spoke about how actually the majority of the text we looked at last week was the question that was posed by a rabbinic tribunal, that is court judges, to Rabbi Meir of Rodenburg. And then we saw Rabbi Meir's response to that court tribunal, to that group of judges. In this instance, we don't have the original question. And that's also kind of, not infrequent. That happens not infrequently in medieval responsa, that we're missing the original question that was posed to the rabbinic authority. It's possible that the original authority didn't preserve the question. It's possible that it got lost by later copyists. All of these things are possible. In this particular instance, although we don't have the original text, the original question that was posed, we're going to see it was also a rabbinic tribunal that posed this question, that is a court judges who posed this question to the respondent, Rabbi Chaim ben Isaac or Zerah. We do have a very detailed re-rendering of that question by Rabbi Chaim himself. So in this particular instance, I have the sense, and this is just from my experience working with these kinds of materials, that Chaim himself decided that rather than transcribing word by word or line by line the original question, he preferred to restate it, to reformulate it as the opening piece, the opening passage of his responsa. So here I think it was not a later copyist's omission. I think it was probably Chaim's decision himself, but that's really just a matter of conjecture. Let's take a look. Let's begin by reading this sort of extensive question, and that will already kind of begin to locate us, both in terms of the topic and in terms of some other issues that are going to be relevant to us today. Rabbi Chaim begins as follows. And by the way, one more word of introduction that I want to add is that we don't actually have the name of the rabbinic judge or judges who submitted this question, right? Unlike, again, in that respect, this particular example is, again, different than the one we saw last week, where the question was signed by 3 specific rabbinic judges. Here we don't have, maybe because we don't have the original question, we don't have the names of the questioners, But I want here again, I'm going to just scroll down to the very end of the responsum. In concluding his responsum, Chaim Or Zarua writes, and again, I'm looking at the very last lines here at the bottom of the text, and peace to my teacher and his Torah and his study hall. Right, in the Hebrew is V'shalom l'mori u'letorato u'liyeshivato. Sincerely, Kecheshek Chaim ben Harav Rabbi Yitzchak, as we said beforehand. So again, although he doesn't name this teacher or this particular study hall. Now, by the way, the word in Hebrew is yeshivato. Some would translate as study hall, as I did here, but there are scholars who argue that yeshivato in this context oftentimes refers to a court, like a sitting court. That word yeshiva, which means to sit, is referring to the sitting of the court. In any event, we know from this context that he's writing to a fellow rabbinic scholar, and we know, again, from the context of the situation, it's going to become very clear that we're talking about a rabbinic scholar who served as a court judge, but we don't know who that individual might have been. Okay, now let's go back and let's get down to business. So I'm back to the beginning of this text, and I'm going to be reading the English, and I'll mention here that this is actually my own translation. If anybody feels that I mistranslated and wants to offer improvements, I'm open to suggestions. I'm going to be reading the English, but certainly those who are interested can follow along in the original Hebrew. And you'll see, by the way, right, the language of this text and of really all the responsa that we're going to be looking at it's Hebrew, although it's a kind of medieval rabbinic Hebrew. That is to say, it's Hebrew mixed in with a lot of Aramaic, with a lot of quotations from the Bible, from the Talmud, and from various other rabbinic texts. So it doesn't read as clean, certainly not modern Hebrew or clean Mishnaic Hebrew, but nonetheless, it is a Hebrew base. I think there might have been a question. If anyone does have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. Okay, so let's begin reading. What you asked concerning Levi, who married a woman, and shortly following their marriage, she cried out, wailing and gripped by labor pains. And Levi sought medical help, right? And the Hebrew word here is refuah. For he said, perhaps this is witchcraft. Right now, what's the situation here? We have a young couple who just got married. And again, it just says a short while, but let's imagine a few weeks after the wedding, suddenly the woman is in labor. Right? Now, what is this husband to think, right? I mean, clearly she can't be in labor from a child that he fathered on the assumptions that this couple did not have relations before their wedding. And so therefore he thought maybe this was witchcraft. And here I do want to note as a kind of aside that in this period, the whole concept of hysteria as a sort of madness, a mental condition associated particularly with women, was very often related to matters of the womb, right? The whole term, the name, the word hysteria comes from the Greek for the womb, for the uterus. And there's all kinds of theories about, women having traveling uteruses that cause them madness, etc. There's more to be said about this, but in any event, this is certainly a very interesting text from that broader medical history perspective. So in any event, this young husband sought some kind of help because he thought maybe his wife had been bewitched. He couldn't understand why else she was yelling out with labor pains at this period of time, at this point in time. And then she ceased her shouting for 2 weeks. But afterwards, on a Thursday night, Levi's wife began to shout and wail as before. And with dawn, Levi crossed the Rhine, that's a reference to the Rhine River, of course, and brought back with him a relative's wife. And the two of them went up to the attic, and she was shouting as before. Ultimately, Levi came down and raised his voice to the heavens and to the earthly creatures, proclaiming, I declare my wife is about to give birth. Now, if his wife is about to give birth, and this is, let's imagine again, a few weeks after their marriage, right? He's decided now that it's not witchcraft. She is in fact in labor, about to give birth. And he makes this public declaration that his wife is about to give birth. What is the obvious implication of his declaration? What is he saying about his wife, essentially? The idea is, again, he's declaring aloud, publicly, that this young woman who he has married and presumably had relations with for the first time just a few weeks ago is now about to give birth. Again, what is the understood implication of his declaration? What is he essentially accusing his wife of?
She got pregnant by someone else beforehand.
Yeah, he's basically, right, and we're going to see that that's the very clear understanding of these rabbinic discussants, right? He is effectively accusing his wife of having had relations prior to their marriage with another man, right? And here, lo and behold, just a few weeks after their wedding, she's about to have this other person's baby, right? That's effectively what he is, again, declaring about her. Let's go back to the text now. Let's get a little bit more of this story under our belts. And he went to Mainz to tell her relatives and her father and mother, in accordance with her relative's wife, that woman who had returned with him, who told him to go. And the relative's wife said that because he had already publicized the matter to all his relatives, that's why she told him to go. Right? She must have said that later on. For it is better that her father and mother and relatives know about it, including the wife of her brother, and we're talking about the young woman in labor's brother, who is skilled at feeling a woman's stomach to ascertain if she is pregnant. And apparently that's in fact what happened, right? That this young husband, Levi, went and told her relatives that in fact she was about to have a child. And this woman who was, again, she must have been some kind of midwife or some kind of medical woman, what medical professional, she came back with him apparently, and she felt her stomach. She felt this young woman's stomach, and she said to Levi, "Don't go to Mainz. She definitely does not have a fetus in her stomach." Right. So when the medical professional actually shows up, right, this again, midwife or whatever she was, she says, "No, this is not in fact a woman who's about to give birth." Right? This must be some kind of, again, whether she was agreeing that this must be some kind of mental condition that was causing her to yell in this kind of way or whether, right, maybe this woman had other motives for claiming that she was having these labor pains, or maybe she was being gripped by some other kind of medical condition. In any event, she said, this woman does not have a fetus in her belly. She is not actually giving birth. Now, apparently at some point, all these testimonies and evidences were gathered, again, probably by the court that forwarded the question to Rabbi Chaim, because he reports next that further testimony came that Levi's wife met with a certain non-Jewish woman. And the non-Jewish woman asked her, "Why did you go to immerse in the ritual bath?" And she told her, this is the wife told her, "They told me to immerse due to cuts in my flesh, and further, that the young men had pushed her until she began to menstruate." Okay, we're going to see what the significance of that is. Why that is a piece of testimony or evidence that Rabbi Chaim bothers to report. And behold, Levi has defamed his wife. Right now, Chaim is laying it out clearly, suggesting that she had become pregnant through prostitution prior to her marriage. Right, and here, by the way, I want to note that the Hebrew here is shehara liznunim. Right, I translated here as prostitution, but the word znunim, znut, is a little bit of a slippery one. It could mean she had been pregnant through fornication, right? Indicating that she just simply had some kind of sexual relationship with another man prior to their marriage, right? It doesn't have to be prostitution in any kind of official sense. Again, the Hebrew is znunim. In any event, she had some kind of inappropriate or illegitimate relationship. And another witness said that the young man's uncle told him, it is not entirely Levi's fault. Now we're going to see fault, what fault might Levi be at here, right? Presumably it's this woman who has been wayward. What are we faulting Levi with? Well, presumably we're faulting Levi for defaming his wife, right? Chaim already laid out the stakes in that regard by making that clear. And as a matter of fact, right, so the uncle said in Levi's defense, it's not his fault, or at least not entirely his fault, for his wife also believed that she was pregnant. And behold, they have excommunicated Levi in 2 communities regarding this affair, right? So apparently, as a result of this whole fallout, this dispute between Levi and his wife, and clearly the families are involved here, Levi, as a result of this, defamation of his wife, has been excommunicated. And now she demands, and now we're going to get to the nitty-gritty of what the halachic dispute is here. She demands that they force him with rods to divorce her and pay her marriage contract, her ketubah. On what grounds? Well, she brings a proof from the Talmud, and that's in Masechet Ketubot, Babylonian Talmud Ketubot 72a. One who takes an oath prohibiting his wife from borrowing a sifter or a sieve, he must divorce her and pay her ketubah, because he defames her among her neighbors, right? So she's bringing a proof from a Braita that is quoted by the Talmud, which says, in fact, that a man who defames his wife, in this case, he's kind of defaming her, or he's giving her a bad name among her neighbors by not allowing her to borrow these kind of standard household items to participate in normal social exchange with her neighbors, with the other women in the neighborhood. A man who does that to his wife, right, who takes an oath preventing her from having normal social exchange, and in that respect gives her a bad name among her neighbors, according to the Braita, he must divorce her and pay her ketubah. And this young woman is claiming that's exactly what's going on here, or all the more so here. We has defamed her for prostitution, and again, it's znut, either prostitution, fornication, however you would prefer to translate that. Okay, Adkan, up until here, is again Rabbi Chaim's summary or reframing, restatement of the question that had been sent to him. And I do, by the way, want to again note in parentheses, the way Chaim presents it here, it's that this young woman has brought a Talmudic proof to her claim. One question that we're going to be asking ourselves here, and in other cases that we're going to see later in the semester, later in our course, is who exactly is, who's running these court cases? Who's in fact laying out the claims of these various litigants? Here we have a couple who has come to court. The wife, apparently it was the wife who brought the husband to court, claiming that he had defamed her, and that as a result of the defamation, she wanted a divorce, and she wanted not to pay any penalties, right? She wanted a divorce with her full ketubah payments. And the husband obviously is countering that by saying, no, right? I'm not willing to divorce her. I'm not willing to pay her ketubah payments, and refusing to accede to her request. Is it likely that this young woman was quoting Talmudic texts herself? My best guess is no. I don't think that's very likely. It was also not the case during this period in time that most individuals came with professional lawyers, but we do see often, although not explicitly in this case, that individual litigants, and women in particular, came to court with what the Responsa will call an apotropos, or some kind of legal representative, who was in many cases, again, non-professional, oftentimes a relative or a close family friend who just took upon himself, and it was always a man, who took upon himself to represent her, or sometimes another man, in court. And so probably, again, if she did ever say this, quote this Talmudic source in court, she was probably, in fact, counseled or coached to do so. I don't assume that this is in any respect a proof of her own Talmudic erudition. But in any event, that's her claim, and that's the sort of halachic backing that she is claiming. Now here, again, I'm going to stop my screen share for just a moment. I want to open up my PowerPoint, and I want to take a look at a few supporting documents that I think will be helpful to us. Just bear with me for 1 second. You can't see that. Let me say, sorry. Let me just quickly share my screen again with you. My apologies. This is not going as smoothly as I had hoped, but give me 1 moment. Bear with me, please. Sorry, just 1 second. I'm not sure why don't see my.
Do you need my help?
I want to share my PowerPoint, and for some reason my PowerPoint is not appearing as one of my options for screen share. Don't know why. It's a little. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Let's hope that I can get this up here in just a moment. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, I hope that you can see that now, my PowerPoints. Okay, so what I wanted to show you just very briefly is, first of all, again, this is a timeline that we've seen in the past. Again, it just the point that I wanted to reiterate is that Rabbi Meir ben Baruch died in 1293. We're talking now about a student of his who's the respondent to this case. So what I'm going to suggest is that most likely this case happened after the point in time that Meir ben Baruch either was incarcerated, that's 1286, or was put into jail. That's the point in time when Chaim and his other students really became the primary rabbinic figures that individuals or courts, in this case, in the German Empire, would have forwarded their questions to. So I think we can date this case to the very end of the 13th, maybe even the early years of the 14th century. What I wanted to show you here also, this is a copy, this is an image, excuse me, of the only complete, it's not even really complete, but the only medieval manuscript of Chaim or Zavra's Responsa to have survived. You can see that it's actually a very beautiful, in terms of the quality of writing, in terms of the layout, a very well copied manuscript. This was copied sometime in the 14th century. So it's not an autograph copy by any means. This was not written by Chaim, this was not copied out by Chaim in his own hand, but it was probably copied by a scribe, or maybe by a student or a relative, sometime pretty soon after Chaim had authored these responsa, first of all. And there's some indication, although as I began to mention before, sometimes these responsa were collected by students, not by the individual themselves. In Chaim's case, there is some indication that he actually did begin the editorial process of gathering and organizing his responsa, again, mixed in with the responsa of some of his predecessors that he wove into this collection of his own responsa. As I said, it's the only medieval copy that we have of this responsum, or of the vast majority of Chaim's responsa. Interestingly, it was published for the first time in the late 19th century, in the 1860s, by an individual named Judah Rosenbaum. Prior to that, it had been kind of lost and fell out of circulation for a good number of centuries. It has since been republished and re-edited, most recently by Menachem Avitan in a, it's not exactly an academic edition, but it is a pretty scholarly edition. For the purposes of understanding exactly the geography of that we're talking about here, right? You'll remember this man, Levi, after his wife began these episodes of yelling out in labor pains, and after he had decided that she must have, again, fornicated with some other man prior to their wedding, it says that he crossed the Rhine to go and inform her relatives in Mainz. So I just want you to take a quick look at what we're talking about geographically. You can see I circled Mainz here on the map. The river that's running down sort of from north to south, that you can see that Mainz is located right next to, that's the Rhine River. You can see it's labeled just below Strasbourg, a little bit further south of Mainz. But you might also see that Mainz is actually at the confluence. It was an important city in this period. You can see also by the little symbol there that it was the seat of a bishopric. And it was an important city in part because it was located at the confluence, at the meeting point between the Rhine River, which again runs north-south, and the Main River, which is the one that's running past Bamberg and Würzburg from the west, from the east to the west. Now Mainz, this is actually a map, as you can see, are from the 16th century, so it's a bit later than our time period. But I think that here, what you can see, this view of Mainz is showing you how it's, again, located. It was on the left or western bank of the Rhine River. The Rhine River is the one that's running across that we're looking directly at, but you can also see where the Main River runs in on this medieval map. And you can see here below that there's also a image taken from Google Maps, a modern day image, where you can see very clearly that Mainz is again on the left or on the western bank of the Rhine River, where the Main River kind of, hits the Rhine. Now, if this Levy and his wife, they must have been living in a small town just across the Rhine from Mainz, right? Because he takes it upon himself, and it doesn't sound like it's such a big journey to travel, to cross the river and to inform her relatives. So again, I don't have we can't zoom into this map, unfortunately, but if we could, you would see that there's all sorts of small towns. Certainly in those days, there were a number of small towns that were located, again, just opposite Mainz on the eastern bank of the Rhine River, and that's probably where this incident is taking place. Okay. Now, one further text that I just want to take a look at before we go back to our responsum itself is, of course, the biblical source of this whole motzi shemra, this concept of defamation, because we're going to see that becomes the halachic heart of this dispute. It is, in fact, in the Bible itself, in the Torah, the source of the whole halachic category of defamation is, in fact, a husband who defames his wife by accusing her of adultery, by accusing her of not having been a virgin when he married her. Again, on the assumption that on his and her assumption that she was, in fact. And these are the famous. This is the famous passage, the famous verses from Deuteronomy 22, from Dvarim Chaf Bet. A householder takes a woman as his wife and cohabits with her, and then he takes an aversion to her. And makes up charges against her and defames her, saying, "This is the party I took to wife, but when I approached her, I found that she was not a virgin." And according to the Torah, in such a case, the girl's father and mother shall produce the evidence of her virginity, of the girl's virginity, before the elders of the town at the gate. And this, is the source of the bloody sheets. And the girl's father shall say to the elders, "To this party I gave my own daughter to wife, but he has taken an aversion to her, so he has made up charges, saying, I did not find your daughter a virgin. But here is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread out the cloth before the elders of the town, and the elders of the town shall then take that party and flog him." Right, the husband gets flogged for his defamation, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give it to the girl's father, for that householder has defamed a virgin in Israel. Moreover, she shall remain his wife, and he shall never have the right to divorce her. Right, and there's obviously a lot to be said, particularly about the sort of insistence that she remain with him and that he not have the right to divorce her, although that does not imply that she does not have the right to request a divorce. But I'm going to put that aside for now. And I do want to go back to our text itself. So I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to go back to, and you can also shift back our attention to the responsum. Okay. So ad kan the question, and I want to pause here for just a moment and ask if there are any questions or comments up to this point. Okay, so let's proceed by reading the actual response. Let's see what Chaim has to say about this matter. Right? I hope that it's clear what is at stake, or some of what's at stake here, and what the dispute is between the two parties. So Chaim says, and I'm now down at the bottom of this first page, "But to me it seems," and this is Chaim's ruling, "that there is no substance to her claims." Right, so the bottom line is, Chaim says, right, she's spewing him for defamation, and specifically she's demanding a divorce and the payment of her ketubah, and Chaim says, "I'm sorry, but there is no substance to her claims. For whenever the Mishnah rules divorce, right, and here he's referring back to that Breita that we saw before, right, that one who takes an oath prohibiting his wife borrowing a sifter or a sieve must divorce her and pay her ketubah, right, and the Hebrew is yotzi v'yiten ketubah. Chaim says when the Mishnah, or the Breita in this particular case, rules yotzi, that is, a man is to divorce his wife, we do not divorce with rods nor excommunication, rather try to convince him with words in accordance with the ruling of Rabbeinu Hananel's "May the memory of a righteous be a blessing" at the beginning of chapter Hamadir. Right, so in other words, he says, whenever we have a series of Mishnayot and other Tanaitic material where various cases are listed in which the sages ruled that in fact, under those given circumstances, a man is yotzi, is supposed to divorce his wife, regardless of whether he wants to or not, right? That is the ruling. Those situations are not tenable. A man should divorce his wife. But Chaim says that language, yotzi, does not imply that the rabbis or the rabbinic courts or whoever the powers may be are actually endowed with the authority to force this individual to divorce his wife, right? We don't divorce him with rods, meaning we do not physically force him to divorce his wife. We don't force him with excommunication or with other kind of social tools to divorce his wife. At most, what we do is we try to convince him with words, right? We work hard to make him see the light, to make him realize that he should divorce his wife, that his wife wants a divorce, that he should be acceding to her request, that their marriage is not a tenable one, right? And this is, again, this touches upon all kinds of larger halachic issues concerning Jewish divorce. Just to quickly recap, we know that according to the Torah and according to rabbinic law, a divorce is valid only if it is issued by the husband of his own free will. And the court cannot force him, and the court can also not issue the divorce in his stead. It has to come from the husband himself. And as many of us are well aware, this kind of sets the stage for a host of major halachic problems up until, unfortunately, today, where women are sometimes trapped in marriages that they really do not want to be in. This causes all kinds of problems with recalcitrant husbands. But nonetheless, again, for our purposes, it's important just to note that that was certainly in Chaim's time the accepted halakha. Let's continue on here, right? So he says, I don't think that this is a case, right? Again, she might have cited that Mishnah, but we're not going to force him to divorce her because that's not what we do. And further, he says, even if divorce meant that we force him, as Rabbi Isaac the Elder believes, that is relevant to a husband who persists in his rebellion against his wife or who took an oath to deny her, such as forswearing sexual relations, as the Tosafot explained. But if he regretted his actions and accepted upon himself not to do it again, it is obvious that we do not force him to divorce his wife, as we derive from the language of the Breita. Right? So he says, even if you want to adopt the rabbinic position that says when the Mishnah or when a Breita says Yotzi v'yiten ketubah, it does allow the rabbis to undertake a certain amount of coercion or force. Even so, that certainly doesn't apply in a case where the husband regrets his actions, where the husband says he won't engage in the behaviors that made them rule that way. And that's the case here, right? The husband might have defamed his wife when she was yelling about having a baby. He might have announced he might have announced or implied that she must have had these illicit relations before their marriage. But now he doesn't want to get divorced. He wants to remain with her, right? He retracts his words. He apologizes and regrets what he said. In that case, certainly we do not force him to divorce her. you can see here that I didn't translate all of the back and forth of this responsum, in which Chaim considers various, mostly Talmudic texts and the medieval interpretations of those Talmudic texts and their implications. And here, by the way, I just want to point out that as far as the kinds of sources and materials that these medieval respondents are considering, I think this is kind of classic, right? They're engaging with the Talmudic text, but they're also citing again the medieval interpretations and their medieval predecessors like Rabbeinu Hananel, like the Ri that we just saw, like the Tosafot that we saw earlier that were cited here. There's a lot of argumentation. This goes back to what I said last week, that during this period in time, these respondents were proving their mettle through the responsa medium itself. They had to engage in this kind of argumentation because that's what gave them the bona fides, that's what gave them the authority to issue the responsa in the first place. They had to kind of prove their scholarly acumen, unlike, I'll just remind you, the Geonim that we saw earlier. So again, there's a lot of back and forth here that we're not going to go into. But I do want to point out that one of the things that Chaim, one of the questions that he raises and things that he considers is what exactly might have been the timeline here, right? She has acquired a bad name. She's acquired a bad reputation because her husband announced or implied in his announcement that she must have had a sexual relationship prior to their marriage. Now, when exactly? And the question of when exactly she would have had that relationship has halachic implications, as far as she's concerned, as far as the husband is concerned, because if we assume, if the implication is that she must have had relations with another man when she was still a single woman, right, prior to her marriage to this man when she was still a single woman, I mean, certainly that was not a, a kosher relationship, but it also wasn't it wasn't the kind of relationship that would have rendered her an adulteress, right? If she had a sexual relationship with a different man prior to ever having been involved with this husband, whatever we might think about her sexual comportment, that would not render her an adulteress. And it certainly would not render her prohibited to her husband. If, however, she had a sexual relationship with another man at a point in time when she was already legally tied to this husband, that would have made her an adulteress. And that would have meant that she was in fact prohibited to remain with this husband. She could not, again, remain in a relationship with the husband. The husband could not maintain her as his wife. Now, how, again, timeline-wise, would that be possible? Well, we know that technically Jewish marriage is comprised of two parts. There are the kiddushin and there are the nisuin. The kiddushin are the formal engagement that kind of designates her as the wife of a particular man, at which point she is forbidden legally to contract a sexual relationship with any other man. But it's the second stage of the marriage, the nisuin, that is today what happens under the chuppah with the sheva brachot specifically. That's the part of the ceremony that actually constitutes the marriage that makes her, in fact, permitted to the husband. Now, today, both parts of this ceremony take place one after the other in immediate succession underneath the chuppah at a Jewish wedding. But in Talmudic times, they in fact were two distinct ceremonies that oftentimes took place almost a year apart, right? So there was a period of time in between the kiddushin and the nisuin where the couple was legally bound to one another, but were not yet in fact living together, cohabiting. They were not yet part of one household. They were not yet married. It's precisely at this period in time, right, in the probably 12th, 13th century in Ashkenaz, that these two ceremonies came to be held, again, simultaneously, immediately one after the other at the same event under the same chuppah, for a variety of reasons, but among them, in order to prevent a lot of sticky situations that were elicited by the separation of the two ceremonies. And so Chaim here gets in, he raises that question because he says, today we usually have these two ceremonies together, but it's possible, it was still possible in his time that a couple might have had the two ceremonies independently of one another, in which case there would have been a period of time in which she was already legally bound to her husband, even if she wasn't yet married to him. And if she had a sexual relationship with another man during that period of time, that would have constituted adultery. And if that were the case, then in fact, she would be forbidden to remain in this current relationship. Again, after a lot of legal back and forth, Chaim concludes that that could not have been possible. And I want to now take a look at the very last paragraph of his responsum, which we have here at the bottom of the page. Rather, it is always the case that if the husband accepts her back, he thereby cancels the rumors, and therefore he need not divorce her. Right. So he says this husband wants to take her back. The ceremonies were not separated, and therefore, by virtue of the fact that the husband wants to take him to remain in this marriage, he has in fact essentially canceled the rumors. He's not continuing to be a defamer of his wife. And we know that this is the case because if it were not so, then every man who accused his wife of adultery would be immediately forced to divorce her and pay her ketubah, right? And the rabbis never like a situation like that where it's really quite easy to get out of a marriage, either for the husband or particularly for the wife. And so he goes on to say, even if it was the law that anyone who defames his wife must divorce her and pay her ketubah, it would seem to me, nevertheless, that in this case, he, the husband, is exempt. Why? Although according to the law, a person is always responsible for the damage he causes, this applies when the victim did not cause the damager to engage in destructive action. But when the victim, right now he's getting into hilchot nizikin, right? What kind of damages are you obligated to pay somebody who you have defamed? Or cause other, that's sort of social damage too. That's, again, when the victim was not implicated in the damages. But when the victim caused the damager to engage in the destructive action, he, that is the damager, is exempt, as the Tosafos proved from the Talmud. And here she, meaning Levi's wife, caused him to defame her by telling the non-Jewish woman that she immersed because of cuts and pushes. Why didn't she say that she had immersed after she had seen virginal blood? Right? That in of itself was a strange thing. And furthermore, if we would force a demand, right, and I guess he doesn't even feel it necessary to say, why was she yelling about having a baby, about having labor pains, if in fact she was not pregnant? And furthermore, if we would force a man to divorce his wife in such circumstances, then every woman would do such a thing to her husband. That is, shortly after her wedding or when her husband returns from abroad, she would scream as though she were about to give birth until her husband says that she's engaged in prostitution, in order to engineer a situation in which we rule that she must be divorced and receives her ketubah. Right? It would leave it much, much, much too easy for a woman to get out of her marriage in this way. And even a bill of divorce that was compelled by non-Jewish law is invalid in order to prevent women from turning themselves over to non-Jews and thus severing their ties with their husbands. And if we do not rule in the manner I suggested regarding our case, what have they achieved? She can still sever her ties in this way. Therefore, it seems to me that we absolutely do not force him to divorce her. And peace to my teacher and his Torah and his study hall. Sincerely, Chaim, son of Isaac. May he rest in Eden. Right, so we see here towards the end, again, Chaim has offered a very Halakhic, very legally astute, legally reasoned answer. But it seems here to me that part of what is coming to the fore and is being expressed in this final section of the responsum gives us a little bit of a window into some of the larger social issues that may have motivated Chaim's response. Right? There was something about this situation or about the precedent that this particular case might set that really disturbed Chaim. And I want to also note here that Chaim was by no means alone in this regard. This is a theme that we hear. It comes up very frequently in the writings of his teacher, Meir of Rotenberg, and the writings of his other students, and many of the other rabbinic figures of the late 13th century, who were very concerned about making divorce too easy, particularly too easy for women. There are all kinds of ways to explain why they might have felt that. There was, in fact, we know that there was, in fact, a phenomenon of very, I don't know if I should say very common, but certainly not uncommon divorces. There was a pretty widespread divorce phenomenon in the community of Ashkenaz at this time, which might surprise some people who think of traditional communities as having been less prone to divorce. That was not the case, certainly in Ashkenaz. That in and of itself might have disturbed these rabbis, but in particular, this is the era after women, thanks to the takanot, to the enactments attributed to Rabbeinu Gershom and to other Ashkenazi authorities, to the rabbis of the famous Shum, Speyer, Mainz, Worms communities, had made, on the one hand, prohibited a man from marrying more than one woman, had banned polygamy, and on the other hand, had insisted that a woman not be divorced against her will. Now, this kind of created, it was intended probably to create more of a balance between men and women in the whole realm of Jewish divorce, but what it certainly added strength to women's hands in that halachic field. And we see, I think, in this Responsa and in others of this nature, a bit of pushback, a bit of discomfort on the parts of rabbis who felt that somehow divorce was becoming a little bit too easy. I'm going to conclude here for now because our time is up. This is a theme that I would like to pick up in future weeks. But I would like, before we sign off, to ask whether anyone has any questions that they might want to ask at this point, or any other thoughts that they would
Did you
like
see
to share.
the question in the chat, Jonathan?
No, I didn't. I apologize.
Oh, no, that's okay. I'll read it to you. Do we have records of or discussions of the high divorce rate? He said he's never heard of that demographic data before.
Yeah, so we do. There are all kinds of, historians talk about this as being a phenomenon, particularly in medieval Ashkenaz. I should note here that we don't have anything like, very clear demographic data for this. This is a period of time where we don't have too many demographic records, but it is mostly from the Responsa and from other halachic discussions like this one that historians are able to piece together and have come to the conclusion that this was a phenomenon, again, not uncommon phenomenon in Ashkenaz, in northern France as well, that divorce was something that certainly the rabbis were very concerned about and speak of as having been a pretty widespread fact of life in those communities. Okay. All right, so I will conclude this for today, but we'll pick up again next week. And at the beginning of next week, I will also give you a little bit of a sense of where these discussions what other kinds of pieces we're going to be seeing over the course of the semester, and where we're going to be taking these discussions in what different directions. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, again for sharing your Torah with us today. Looking forward to next week. And thanks to all the participants, not only here on Zoom, but also those who are watched us live on Facebook. Just a reminder that registration is still open for all the spring Zman classes. You can go on our website, 5784.drisha.org/spring. Starting this Sunday, I believe it's a new class, Mishnah in Depth, Masechet Nedarim with Rabbi David Silber. It's at 1 p.m. Eastern. This is a continuation of the Mishnah in Depth series following the Mishnah Yomit schedule. So again, we'd love